Hey, good morning in New York. Good afternoon in Spain. We are fortunate to have Professor Shevchuk from Columbia University for this lecture that was going to be our last, um, but it's going to be our next week because we had to cancel, as some of you may know, Professor Service's lecture to Wednesday next week. So I hope that you can find it possible to be the audience for that one as well. But in the meantime, we are happy to very distinguished guest whose biography you're gonna find very interesting. Let me say a couple of words by way of introduction before giving him the floor. Uh, Shevchuk is the senior lecturer of the Ukrainian language at Columbia University. He holds a PhD in Germanic philology from Kiev State University and MA in political science from the New School for Social Research in New York. In 1990 and 2012, he taught Ukrainian language at Harvard, and currently at Columbia University, he teaches courses in Ukrainian, Soviet, and post-Soviet film, as well as Slavic culture. He has written numerous books and articles on different matters that perhaps, especially if you have a chance, you might describe some of them that you might find most interesting for the non-public. In 2004, Professor Shevchuk founded the Ukrainian Film Club at Columbia University, which is the only permanent forum for Ukrainian film in North America. Professor Shevchuk is a member of the Taras Shevchenko Scientific Society in the USA, as well as the Ukrainian Filmmakers Union and the Ukrainian Film Academy. And Professor, thank you very much for being present. Take it away. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Alvarez, for inviting me to participate in this important session on Ukraine that was organized at your school. I'm honored and I'm glad that I can make my small contribution to expanding a little bit the knowledge of Ukraine, of modern Ukraine, and share some thinking about Ukrainian culture. I hope the technology helps us today as opposed to obstruct us, because sometimes you never know. I was asked to focus on things like language, literature, arts, and cinema. And I propose to build our talk and hopefully the post-presentation discussion in such a way that first I will dwell on some important aspects of Ukrainian culture. Of course, it's impossible to even start talking about Ukrainian culture in a brief lecture presentation. It merits a course extended over 2 semesters rather than one lecture. So I will just outline certain basic things about these components of Ukrainian culture, language, literature, arts, and cinema. And then I will propose a conceptual framework within which that I think is helpful to understand what has gone on and what is going on with Ukrainian culture today during the all-out Russian aggression against the independent country of Ukraine. So let's start with something that is closest to me, since I have taught Ukrainian language since 1990, first at Harvard University and since 2004 at Columbia, Yale, and later at Yale and Cornell. So Ukrainian language counts some 41 million native speakers worldwide. It's an East Slavic language alongside Belarusian and Russian. It is a synthetic, as opposed to analytical, language with an extensive system of flexions. Nouns have 7 cases, adjectives 6. The Ukrainian verb has 4 tenses, 2 aspects. Ukrainian developed from the Common Slavic, or some linguists call it Proto-Slavic language, starting in the 9th century. And Ukrainian alphabet is based on the Cyrillic system and has 33 letters. 3 of those letters are unique to Ukrainian alphabet. They are Ye, Ge, and Yi. And the last letter is so unique that it very often is treated as a symbol of Ukrainian distinctiveness. And we have a literary magazine called Yi, simply having a title in 1 letter. It's published in Lviv. The last census in Ukraine was held in 2001, and according to it, almost 68% of Ukrainians declared Ukrainian to be their mother tongue, and almost 30% declared Russian to be their mother tongue. The tendency has been over the last decades for Ukrainian speakers, the number of Ukrainian speakers to increase, and the number of Russian speakers to decrease in Ukraine for a number of reasons, which I'm not going to go into. According to the national poll held in late March this year, already 77% consider Ukrainian to be their mother tongue, as opposed to 20% Russian. Ukrainian and other Slavic languages. Ukrainian is closest to Polish and Belarusian in its vocabulary. Ukrainian and Russian are not mutually comprehensible, and many people might be surprised by that, but the myth of the mutual comprehensibility of Ukrainian and Russian is really a Russian imperial fabrication, which is nourished by the assertion that is groundless, that Ukrainian is not really even a language. It's just a variety, a southwestern variety of Russian. So that's how they are mutually comprehensible. If you take a Russian from Russia or a Ukrainian from the United States, people who are not exposed to each other's languages, they will not understand each other. It's as simple as that. The lexical composition of Ukrainian in a randomly taken page of fiction, composed of some 300 words, you can see the breakdown. 216 words are of common Slavic origin, 8 of Polish borrowings, basically 16th and 17th century, 16 more recent Russian borrowings, and 8 are internationalism. And this kind of breakdown changes when we go from a fiction text to non-fiction. And you can see for yourself, I hope you can see my screen, and it's legible, you can read from it. Ukrainian is a highly developed and functionally stratified modern European language. By different accounts, there are between 250,000 to 1 million words in modern Ukrainian. Ukrainian lexical system is highly stratified as to its function and stylistic coloring. And Ukrainian lexis includes the common core vocabulary, which is the most highly frequently used, but also colloquialisms, slang, vulgarisms, neologisms, archaisms, poeticism, terminology of all branches of science, music, jurisprudence, finance and business, and so on and so on and so on. And in the period between 1596 and today, there were composed and published, or compiled and published, more than 9,250 dictionaries. One of them, lately published, is my own dictionary. You can see it in the background. It's called Ukrainian English Collocation Dictionary, which has no precedence in lexicography. I can dwell on that if you're interested later in the Q&A. So Ukrainian, let's move on. I wanted just to point out to some important moments in the history of modern Ukrainian literary language. The first literary work in modern Ukrainian, entitled Eneida, was written in and published in 1798 by Ivan Kotlяревский, who grew up and lived in eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine at the time was the source from which Ukrainian identity started forming itself and emanate all kinds of things like language, literary texts, theater, and stuff like that. Ivan Kotlяревский, therefore, is often called the father of modern Ukrainian language. The most important Ukrainian national poet is Taras Shevchenko. Not the player, not the football player. I caution you not to mix the two of them. I remember I was once surprised out of my wits in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, meeting a Brazilian and introducing myself. I'm from Ukraine, and he said, "Oh, of course, Shevchenko." And I was completely surprised how he can know our national poet. I said, "How, you like poetry, right?" So he said, "No, poetry, football." So, but it's easy to remember. His name is Taras, not Andriy. Other Ukrainian classical writers are Panteleimon Kulish, Ivan Franko, Lesia Ukrainka, and they just are a few of dozens of Ukrainian literature counts dozens of writers that created it. I don't know if you would be curious to, I wanted to just read to you a little poem, not even all of it, so that you have an experience of what Ukrainian sounds like. And it's a very well-known poem by Lesia Ukrainka, written in response to the prohibition of public use of Ukrainian language in the Russian Empire in the late 19th century. And Lesia Ukrainka addresses Ukrainian word and asks, "Why are you not as hard as a tempered steel?" Слово, чому ти не тверда, як криця, що серед бою так ясно іскриться? Чом ти не гострий, безжалісний меч, той, що здійма вражі голови з плеч? Ти моя щира, гартована мова, я тебе видобуть з піхви готова. Тільки ж ти кров з мого серця проллєш, вражого ж серця клинком не проб'єш. And so forth. I'm not going to expose you to the entirety of this poem, but Ukrainians like to think of their language as balanced. There's a balance between vocals and consonants, and they are almost obsessed with that balance. If there are Slavic languages that are famous for their consonant clusters, and in Ukrainian those clusters are minimal. If they appear in a word, they are simplified so that there is the vowel and consonant, vowel and consonant. Likewise, Ukrainians do not like two vowels in a row, so that they would insert a consonant to kind of balance them out. And in that sense, Ukrainians also think that their language is probably best suited of Slavic languages to opera because of this balance between consonants and vowels. But I take that kind of mythology with a grain of salt, because every language community has these kind of myths validating their own languages. But what I think is very, very true as a teacher of language is that there are no ugly and beautiful languages. There are simply languages that one knows, and languages that one does not know. The moment you start learning a language, you are doomed to fall in love with it. And that's the kind of an attitude I have teaching Ukrainian, and I confirm it seeing the same kind of attitude appearing in my students. So the history of Ukrainian language is also a history of consistent attempts to erase the language, to reduce it to zero, to kill it. In other words, it's a history of linguicide. Limitations on the public use of Ukrainian language were put in place by different invaders that occupied Ukraine, the Poles, but most intensely and consistently by Russian authorities. Russian policies towards Ukrainian language pursued one goal: simply to reduce it to non-existence. Russian imperial attitudes toward Ukrainian language can be very kind of pithily, briefly expressed in the famous kind of one-liner by the imperial minister of the interior, Valuyev, who famously said of the Ukrainian language, I quote in my own English translation from Russian, there was never, there is not, and there can never be a Ukrainian language. And that is the pronouncement that was articulated in 1864, and ever since then it kind of symbolized Russian attitude not only to the Ukrainian language but to the Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian civilization as such. They simply do not exist. Soviet linguicide had its own very peculiar, innovative element to the policies designed at destroying Ukrainian language. If we compare other Soviet empire, colonial empire, to classic colonial empires like the Spanish, like the British, like the French, there is something that the Spanish, the French, the British never thought of doing to the languages of their colonized nations. What they did basically was prohibiting non-imperial languages from public use and exhorting or using all means of violence to kind of shut them down. The Soviets did not directly resort to this classical policy of public prohibition on the use of the language of colonized. What they used was really an innovation, an imperial innovation, which consisted in interfering within the very structure of the language and changing it in such a way as to bring it maximally closer to the Russian language at the level of the phonetic system, at the level of morphology, syntax, vocabulary, phraseology. And they did it in a very massive kind of way. For instance, trying to do away with the features of the Ukrainian language that marked it off, that made it original, interesting, and unlike, different from Russian. For example, Russian grammar does not have vocative case. Ukrainian does have a vocative case. So Russians, at one point in the early 1930s, issued a new set of Ukrainian orthography rules saying that vocative case in Ukrainian is not really a case, it's a form, it's an aberration, and it's not obligatory to be used. They also, for instance, Ukrainian dative case has a special ending for nouns that are animate nouns, that are living beings. And that ending does not exist in Russian. So again, that ending was declared optional and kind of ousted from usage. And these examples are galore. There were books and kind of studies published about how Russian Soviet authorities try to undermine Ukrainian language from within, make it an impoverished and primitivized simulacrum of the great Russian language. The great Russian language is a quotation of famous saying by the Russian writer Ivan Turgenev. We were all taught, all non-Russians in the under the Soviet occupation, when the Soviet Union was still around, at school were taught to think of Russian not simply as a language, but by all means the great and powerful Russian language. In Russian, it is Великий и могучий русский язык. And to the measure Russian was, it was suggested to all of us that Russian is the great and powerful. By the same token, every non-Russian language was weak and small. That kind of a psychology was, or attitude was instilled, implanted into almost into the subconscious of generation of Ukrainians. It's important for the history of Ukrainian language, but also of culture as a whole and identity, the period that is called the Ukrainian Renaissance. And it lasted not even 1 decade. It was kind of the result of relaxation of the colonial imperial Russian policies in Ukraine and other non-Russian colonies of the Soviet Union, like Belarus, like the Caucasian republics, Central Asia, when local languages and cultures were briefly encouraged to develop without oppression, Russian cultural oppression. And that immediately caused about an incredible explosion of Ukrainian cultural creativity in language, when entire terminological systems were designed to cater for new branches of knowledge, literature, science, arts, and cinema. And Ukrainian, we are taught to think that nationalism and communism are mutually exclusive things or orientations. Well, not in the case of Ukraine. In the 1920s, Ukraine had 3 communist parties, 3, not 1, and all of them, in various ways, with the exception of 1, were also nationalist parties. They professed the possibility of creating a communist society based on national identity. And one of their most important ideologues, called Mykola Khviliovy, in the late 1920s, proclaimed the famous slogan. He was a communist and he was a nationalist. And the slogan sounded like this: away from Moscow, full steam towards psychological Europe. That, of course, that period was quickly put an end to. The Soviets felt deeply threatened by this explosive development of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian assertiveness. And they literally rounded up the crème de la crème of the Ukrainian intelligentsia and cultural figures and physically killed them. Therefore, this first Ukrainian Renaissance is also known as the executed Renaissance. And that's the expression of the Polish humanist Jerzy Giedroyc, who published the famous Cultura in Paris. So within that, the start of this genocide orchestrated against Ukrainians and their culture and their identity, Ukrainian culture was slated for destruction. Literary figures, scientists, historians, linguists, philosophers, economists, film and theater directors, actors, and others were targeted, rounded up, accused of being, quote, bourgeois nationalists, and often fascists. And as a result, about 86% of all Ukrainian writers who published anything at that time ended up being killed by the Soviets. They were also, it would be curious to point out, or interesting for you to know, that at that time they were also called fascists. So what you hear today from the Kremlin calling Ukrainians Nazis is nothing new. It's just the continuation of the same logic of dehumanizing Ukrainians before killing them. So to the Russian imperial mind, being Ukrainian, speaking Ukrainian, loving the Ukrainian people has been, and continues to be tantamount to being a fascist. Ukrainian arts also exploded in the early 20th century. And much like European art, they included such aesthetic schools as Impressionism, Art Nouveau, Cubism, Futurism, Abstractionisms, but all with the Ukrainian twist to it. We're all incorporating Ukrainian elements in them. And unlike mainstream European modernism, and probably similar to I don't know much of the Spanish modernism. I know a little bit of Catalan, which is part of Spanish modernism. They incorporated, instead of rejecting tradition, negating it, they reinvented Ukrainian traditional art. And I don't know how well you can see the three reproductions of the Ukrainian artist called Vsevolod Maximovich. He lived to be only 20 years old. He committed suicide at the age of 20. But his pictures are very, they exemplify this synthesis of the national with the modernist. So you can see here he uses the influences of ancient Babylonian art with the Ukrainian folk art kind of developed around the city of Poltava in central eastern Ukraine, and secession. Maximovich is also called Ukrainian Gustav Klimt, because he was so very deeply influenced by Klimt. And for those of you who know the British graphic artist Beardsley, Audrey Beardsley, you can immediately recognize his influence in this black and white monochromatic picture called The Masquerade. That's almost like a direct quotation from Aubrey Beardsley. You see, it's a very small, but still long enough a list of Ukrainian artists of that era that represent various trends in Ukrainian artists. You will find people that you are accustomed to think of as Russians, but despite the fact that they themselves called and considered themselves to be Ukrainian, but continue to be known to the outer world as Russian. We can discuss that if you like, in greater detail. Ukrainian cinema, also much like the rest of Ukrainian culture, was subsumed and had been subsumed under the title of Russian cinema. And very often it is not even realized in the external world that certain very important figures of Ukrainian cinema are Ukrainians, and they contributed not only to the development and the innovation of cinema in Ukraine, but they are considered to be some among 10 or 20 most important filmmakers of all nations and of all times. And Alexander Dovzhenko is certainly one of them. I once interviewed the legendary American filmmaker called Peter Bogdanovic, who passed away, I think, 2 months ago. I had a long conversation with him at his home here in Upper West Side. And I asked him what did he think of Ukrainian film. And he said, I don't think anything. I don't know Ukrainian film exists. I say, well, don't you know Alexander Dovzhenko? Oh, I love Dovzhenko, but isn't he Russian? But that goes to say how deeply Russian narratives of Ukraine and Ukrainian culture were ingrained in the minds of the world, and how deeply buried Ukrainian culture and Ukraine's contribution to world culture was due to the hegemony of Russian narratives and Russian senses and Russian imperial domination. Dziga Vertov, who is traditionally considered to be a Russian filmmaker, made 3 of his most important films. They were commissioned and made by at the Ukrainian film studios. And not only that, they also were made about Ukraine, fully or in part, like his most famous film, A Man with a Movie Camera. So in that sense, Dziga Vertov, there are more reasons to consider Dziga Vertov a Ukrainian filmmaker. The second important period in Ukrainian film was associated with the so-called Second Ukrainian Renaissance, which coincided with the relative relaxation of censorship under Nikita Khrushchev in the late 1950s and mid 1960s, and an entire new aesthetic school of Ukrainian cinema was born. It's called the Ukrainian Poetic cinema. Primarily, it is associated with cult figure Sarkis Parajanyan, who is better known in the Russified version of his original Armenian name, Sergei Parajanov, or Serhiy Parajanov. Serhiy is Ukrainian, but it's an entire school of writers. I'm galloping forward because I still have a lot to cover. So these are some more important pivotal moments in modern Ukrainian culture that only scratch the surface of Ukrainian culture. But I wanted to switch to the second part, the conceptual part, how I propose to think of Ukrainian culture today. And the history of Ukrainian culture has been the history of its colonial incorporation and appropriation by the imperial Russian culture. The Russian imperialism, as any imperialism, in fact, had a parasitic nature. It created the conditions that compelled non-Russians who were talented, who were ambitious, who had something to say, they thought, that they could do that only if they became Russian, if they abandoned their inherited culture, their language, their point of view, and accepted the imperial Russian point of view, culture, and value system. So that's one of the reasons why Ukraine, up until very recently, as a culture, as a civilization, as a language, as literature, has been invisible to the outer world. People were genuinely surprised that there is such an identity and such a civilization that calls itself Ukraine and that is deeply different from Russia. Occupation of Ukraine, which lasted, Russian occupation of Ukraine, which lasted for more than 300 years, also meant isolation from the world. The vibrant culture of the Ukrainian Baroque was connected with Europe politically, religiously, culturally by myriads of threads. When Ukraine became Russian colony, these threads were all severed, and the cultural currents were rerouted from Kiev directly to Europe via Moscow and via St. Petersburg. And Ukraine was reduced from a European culture to an distant province of the Russian Empire. Ukrainian culture is also knows a long tradition of religious tolerance and multi-confessionalism. Ukrainians are accustomed for centuries to coexist with several Orthodox, Christian Orthodox churches, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Roman Catholicism, Judaism, Islam, and Protestantism. So we have no tradition of an established single state religion in Ukraine. In that sense, Ukrainians are, it can be argued, are more predisposed to tolerance and therefore to democracy. Imperial appropriation of the colonized by the colonizer has been a story of Ukrainian culture for centuries. The only way for self-realization and self-expression was through assimilation with the imperial Russian culture. Brain drain from Ukraine to Russia started as early as early 18th century and included politicians, clergy, scholars, artists, composers, and on and on and on. And it stopped really with the second installment of all-out Russian aggression on February 24th this year. Moving from Ukraine to Muscovy also meant Russification. Ukrainians also greatly influenced Russian culture. In the late 17th century Moscow, there were 7 monasteries, all populated by Ukrainians and Belarusians. The Patriarch Nikan church reform was carried out by Ukrainians. In 1764, the Moscow Slavo-Greco-Latin Academy, the first Russian university, was headed by Ukrainians. Of its 19 presidents, 16 were Ukrainians. Ukrainian Stefan Yavorsky, a metropolitan, became head of the Russian Orthodox Church after the death of its last patriarch, Adrian. And in 1762, there were 70 Ukrainian bishops in Russia, and on. So these are some of the central figures of Russian culture who are not only Ukrainian geographically or by origin, but who introduced Ukrainian sensibilities and Ukrainian influences into Russian culture. In music, Dmitro Bortnyansky, Maxim Berezovsky, Artem Vedel introduced the massive influence of Ukrainian religious music and Ukrainian folk music. In arts, the Academy of Arts at St. Petersburg had Ukrainian artists in large numbers. The most influential of them created Russian identity. The famous monuments that you see of Minin and Pozharsky in the Red Square is the work of a Ukrainian sculptor, Ivan Martos, and many others. Painters like Dmitro Levitsky, Volodymyr Borovikovsky were also Ukrainian. Dmitro Levitsky, for example, who was a famous portraitist, Ukrainian portraitist who worked in St. Petersburg, was also recognized. He painted a portrait of Denis Diderot, the French philosopher, that considered that portrait to be the best ever painted by any painter. There's another Ukrainian painter that is known to the world as Russian, Volodymyr Borovikovsky. Now, I wanted to propose to you that a very helpful conceptual framework within which we can think of Ukrainian culture and its interaction with Russian imperial culture is the an analysis of the Holodomor, the genocide that was orchestrated against Ukrainians by Moscow, by Bolshevik Moscow, in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when everything edible, all grain, was confiscated from Ukraine by the Bolshevik regime, and as a result, an artificial famine erupted, and as a result, in the course of some 7 months, between 4.5 to 6 million Ukrainian peasants were killed. That is known to the Ukrainian historical memory under the word of Holodomor. Holod is hunger and mor is death. So it's death by hunger. It's Ukrainian equivalent of the Holocaust. It's kind of constitutional for modern Ukrainian identity, very much like the Holocaust is for modern Jewish identity. And the Jewish Polish humanist Raphael Lemkin, whose writings became basis for modern legal definition of genocide in international law, took the Holodomor as a case study of genocide. And he wrote about a four-pronged attack by Moscow against Ukrainian identity to destroy Ukrainians as a nation, as a civilization. The first was a blow to the head of the nation, the destruction of Ukraine's political and cultural elites. It started with the trial of the Ukraine Liberation Union, which was all fabricated. There was no such a union in existence, but it became a show trial that started the destruction of Ukrainian cultural elite. The second was a blow to the heart of the nation, which meant the destruction of Ukraine's religious organization, the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church. The third, a blow to the body of the nation, the killing by hunger of more than 4 million Ukrainian peasants, the principal carriers of Ukrainian identity. And the fourth was a mass resettlement of Russians to the ethnically cleansed Ukrainian territories. Why this analytical framework is so important? Because all of its four elements have been observed and occur throughout the history of Ukrainian-Russian interaction, including the current Russian aggression. So, number one, today we see consistent attacks against Ukrainian government institutions, a dozen plots to assassinate the president of Ukraine and Ukrainian political leadership, abduction and murder of Ukrainian officials, politicians, and activists in the occupied territories of Ukraine, destruction of cultural institutions, museums, libraries, schools, universities, archives, and others. As of May 22 this year, Russians destroyed more than 353 cultural sites, including the Museum of the 18th century Ukrainian philosopher Grigory Skovoroda, museums of such artists as Aivazovsky, Kuinji in Mariupol, a historical 18th century church in Chernihiv, the Mariupol Drama Theater, and others, burning of Ukrainian language books, school textbooks, history books, banning Ukrainian language from public sphere, You cannot speak Ukrainian in Russian occupied territories without exposing yourself to being killed. Number two, persecution and destruction of Ukrainian churches, which is Ukrainian independent spiritual self-organization. Murder of priests. Russians destroyed more than 100 churches in Ukraine today. In the 1930s, 75% of churches in Kiev alone were destroyed by Russian Bolsheviks, including the St. Michael's Golden Dome Cathedral, built in the 11th century. Number three, deliberate murder of Ukrainian civilian population. Shelling residential areas of Kyiv, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Korosteny, and on and on and on. Deliberate policy of preventing Ukrainian farmers from sowing grain, targeting civilian infrastructure. Russians today, as they did in the 1930s, weaponize hunger. They try to create shortages of food in order to create hunger, but this time not only in Ukraine, but in the world. Russian government news agency RIA Novosti published an article entitled "What Should Russia Do with Ukraine?" Authored by one Timofey Sergeytsev. It argues that, quote, a significant part of the popular mass of Ukrainians are passive Nazis, and a total purification should be carried out. Russian forces should not draw sharp distinctions between Ukraine's military and civilians. A significant part of the popular mass, which are passive Nazis, accomplices to Nazism, is also guilty. War criminals and active Nazis must be punished, end of quote. The document is evidence, and this is an official document. It's published by official government, Russian government news agency that cannot publish anything without the Russian government approval. So it is evidence that Moscow was planning a genocide of a scale never seen since the end of the Second World War. Russian army units were to be followed by riot police. Russia's military brought 45,000 body bags and mobile crematoria to Ukraine. Ukrainianism is an artificial anti-Russian construction, that document claims, that does not have its own civilization. There was never, there is not, and there never can be a Ukrainian nation. Remember the famous Valuyev pronouncement. And fourth, mass resettlement of population, which is going on as I speak. Ukrainian citizens in the Russia-occupied territories are moved out to Russia. Thousands of Ukrainian children are separated from their parents and moved to Russia for, quote, re-education and denazification. Today's news say that Russians did not allow a single Ukrainian child to be evacuated from the area of Kherson. Russian occupiers create unbearable conditions for the indigenous population, Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, in order to compel them to move out and that way evacuate the area for Russian settlers. I'm going to skip, hoping that you're going to have questions and we have a kind of a discussion. An important element or property of Ukrainian culture is its global nature. Why is it important? We were taught, we Ukrainians, were taught by Russian imperialism, as much as the world, that Ukrainians are, by definition, a provincial culture. It's the culture of the village. Ukrainians are incompatible with the city, with modernity, and with the world. And to live in the city and to function in the world, a Ukrainian had to become Russian. And that, again, another fabrication of Russian imperialism that flies in the face of the reality, of the facts on the ground. And one of those important facts, which is difficult to deny, is that for more than 100 years, Ukrainian culture has also been a global culture. And this is not a metaphor. Due to a number of historical reasons, millions of Ukrainians had to abandon their homeland and look for happiness and self-realization abroad. Waves of Ukrainian migrations reached the New World, the United States, more than 150 years ago, and Canada, and more than 100 years, countries like Brazil and Argentina, and lately, more recently, countries, Western European countries. Ukrainians differed from other diasporas, from other immigrants, by the acute realization of their mission to their culture and their civilization that was under the threat of destruction by Russians, that they had to continue developing it in exile. And therefore they created dozens of scientific, cultural, religious institutions that continue the tradition of Ukrainian culture abroad. And they continued to publish books, texts, to run schools, and to run institutions, even to create a Ukrainian analog of Hollywood, making Ukrainian films with Ukrainians at the center of the narrative. And so today, Ukrainian culture is a truly global culture with centers that yield very great influence, not only in the United States and in Canada and in other countries, and that influence is both cultural but also political. And but they also influence Ukraine, the mainland of Ukraine, culturally, politically, economically, financially, whatnot. Just one example: when the Russian aggression erupted in full scale in late February, we Ukrainians here in the United States, together with American partners of other backgrounds, of Anglo-Saxon Jewish backgrounds and others, started a campaign called Stand with Ukraine Through Film, and to raise the awareness of events in Ukraine, but also to raise funds and money to help Ukraine's war effort to repel Russian aggression. It exploded over 1 week. 600 American movie houses expressed their willingness to screen one single Ukrainian film as part of that initiative. On the 22nd of June this month, we are going to screen this same film at the United States Congress on the Capitol Hill. This is just one isolated example of the global reach of Ukrainian culture, and there are really many such examples. As a conclusion, I would just like to say that since mid-18th century till 1991, Ukrainian culture developed under the condition of hostile occupation by foreign powers, the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, Poland, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, most importantly, the Russian Communist Empire, also known as the Soviet Union. In spite of this, Ukrainians managed to develop a multifaceted, highly branched and refined high culture and extensive popular culture that includes a literary language standard, literature, theater, filmmaking, arts, architecture, and other spheres of human expression. Ukrainian culture has, until quite recently, been largely invisible to the outer world as a result of the Russian colonial domination over Ukraine and the hegemony of the Russian imperial narratives in the world. That includes, unfortunately, Spain up until recently, but things hopefully are going to quickly change for the better. And finally, it's time to examine the so-called Great Russian culture in all its manifestations, including its liberal variety, as the instrument of imperialism and aggression, whose goal it has been for centuries to assist Moscow's expansion and the projection of its power in the world. Thank you for attention and for your invitation again. And I will be happy to entertain your questions and comments.
Well, thank you, Professor. I have to say that I have great expectations for your lecture, and your presentation has exceeded every one of them, every last one of them, no question about it. We have about 10 minutes, if you have as much.
I do.
Oh, okay, very well. Very well. Okay. We have a few questions already in the chat, and I have one of my own. Given the time constraints, would you like to ask to answer one by one every question, or would you like me to bunch up the whole 4 or 5 questions that I have for you to comment sequentially?
I'm flexible. I'm flexible, and I'll try to be disciplined and not.
Okay. Okay. Let me bunch up a couple of them to begin with. First one is, are you knowledgeable of what is the educational policy of the Ukraine government for primary education in terms of the teaching of both languages, the Ukrainian and the Russian? I don't know if that is a national policy or every oblast has its own policy in terms of, okay, this many hours of Ukrainian, this many hours of Russian, depending on the location of the student. That's one question. Second question would be, would it be possible for you to explain a little bit about the Collocation Dictionary that you wrote? A third question would be, this is an interesting one. It says, are the Ukrainian last names, are the letters NKO or UK the equivalent of what would be son in Scandinavian or English? And there's one person who is curious about about Maximovich, the painter, what caused him to commit suicide at 20. And yeah, I think more than enough of that.
Great, thank you so very much for such great questions. I cannot offer you statistical specifics about the education in Ukrainian schools and the breakdown between Ukrainian and Russian language, but the tendency has been over the last 30 years of a very timid, very inconsistent, and very kind of chaotic policy of decolonization of Ukrainian educational system, and bringing it in correlation. Number one, doing away with disproportionately great presence of Russian language, culture, and senses and values in this system by reducing the number of hours that are allocated for Russian language and Russian literature, but also, for instance, in world literature was taught in elementary and secondary schools. It's a school that is 11 grades under the rubric of Russian literature, and it was taught in Russian. Again, Russian culture parasitized on world culture that way. So now there has been a reduction over the last years when Russian aggression started, and the fact that Russian imperialism has always instrumentalized, weaponized its culture and its language, finally caused Ukrainian authorities to regard the presence of Russian language and culture in curriculum as a weapon against Ukrainian independence. So over the last 8 years, this process of decolonization has greatly accelerated. But as everything else in Ukraine, it's ambivalent. Because if you look at the statistic, the capital of Ukraine does not have a single may not have a single Russian language school. If you go to any so-called officially Ukrainian language school, you will find that both students and teachers speak Russian. So this kind of lax implementation of the law, of the requirements, probably will take time. That's the long and short of it. I know it's a huge question. The Collocation Dictionary, this is what it looks like. And basically, it teaches you how to combine words with other words in a stream of speech. So, for instance, if you open the dictionary at any entry, like initiative, and it says initiative, and then it tells you what kind of initiative can there be. For instance, an important, great, major initiative, grandiose initiative, exciting, bold, silly, timely, and on and on and on. Then what you can do with initiative, you can take an initiative, you can implement an initiative, welcome an initiative, reject, approve, and so on. Then what can initiative do itself? Be related to, be aimed at, include something, be a success, and so on and so forth. So, and that in two languages, both in Ukrainian and in English. There are such dictionaries, monolingual dictionaries in one language, but there are, I know not of any bilanguage dictionary that gives you such things in both languages. This dictionary kind of combines principal features of 6 types of dictionaries. One is of collocations, how to collocate words that I just demonstrated to you. Another one is translation dictionary, phraseological dictionary, because it has phraseologies in both languages, synonyms, dictionary of synonyms, because it gives synonyms and antonyms, and an encyclopedic dictionary, and a learner's dictionary. I can give you a whole presentation on it, but I will stop. I'll have mercy on you. Thank you for your interest. Ukrainian last names. The most typical, the most frequently used Ukrainian last names end in enko, which does mean son, the son of somebody. So Shevchenko means the el hijo de zapatero. Shvets is un zapatero, and enko is un hijo de un zapatero. Uk, like my name, I'm also related to a zapatero, but Uk can be interpreted both as a son, but also as an apprentice, somebody who learns the craft of making shoes. So, but there are like 30 different other less common, less frequently used derivative paradigms of Ukrainian family names. They are wonderfully interesting. For instance, there is a paradigm like Pavlishin, Stefanishin, which means the son of the wife of Stefan. Pavlishin is the son of the wife of Pablo. right? So Pavlo is Pavlo, Pavlicha is the wife of Pavlo, and Pavlishin is the son of the wife of Pavlo. Call it Ukrainian proto-feminism that goes centuries back. Okay, and Maximovich is a fantastic biography. He was from the Poltava region. He belonged to a commune of young men admiring the beauty of human body. They were nudists, but he was also gay. He was homosexual, and the theory they say that two things contributed to his suicide. The first one was a disastrous. His first exhibition in Moscow of his works was a disaster. It was criticized, it was ripped to pieces. That was a horrible shock to him, which was also amplified by the fact that he got married to a woman, probably pretending that he is interested in women erotically, and his first night with her supposedly was not what it was supposed to be, and he took he watched his own suicide. He took a dose of morphine, and he agonized for more than 24 hours, dying. He could not be rescued, and that was a horribly agonizing death. He left behind some 12 canvases. All are very beautiful. If you ask me, they are magnetic. They hypnotize. He also is featured in the first avant-garde silent film, which was a film. I'm forgetting its title, where he is in the lead role. The film did not survive, but there are descriptions of that film. And his paintings are in the used to be in the Ukrainian National Picture Gallery, that is now under the direct threat of Russian destruction by Russians. So hopefully, we all hope that they are in safe place. Ukrainian museum workers do not share their information where they hide them naturally.
Thank you, Professor. And I have one question of my own, if I may.
Absolutely, even 2 or 3.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by the following, particularly in the context that we are now, obviously. You look back in time and you see great men and women who are of Ukrainian descent, Ukrainian born, in fact, that have contributed to the arts and literature of the Russian Empire of the centuries. And you think of Gogol, you think of Bulgakov, you think of Kuinji or Riepin, you think of Trotsky. What is the relation of the average Ukrainian? What is the way Ukrainians feel about those people? I mean, do they claim as their own? Do they think they were born in Ukraine, but in fact they belong to another culture? I imagine this is very ambivalent, and every Ukrainian might feel differently about it, but I'm very intrigued by that.
Well, Ukrainians are now in the process of a very painful revision of their attitudes towards figures like Bulgakov and others. I understand you mentioned those figures of culture and history that are related, connected biographically to Ukraine, or even sentimentally, and each of them merits a separate kind of examination and reevaluation. But there's also a reevaluation and critical reexamination of the role of Russian culture in Ukrainian history, and of the role of the so-called good Russians, Russians that are supposedly not part of the open Russian imperial propaganda and apology of Russian imperialism. And this re-examination very often is kind of emphasizes the fact that Russian culture is so endemically imperialist that even the so-called good Russians, who had pro-Ukrainian leanings, can be more dangerous than the openly imperialist Russians, even because by their mere presence as part of the entire body of Russian culture, they humanized, normalized, and made acceptable the culture that is inherently toxic, that always ends in brutality, in war, in suppression, in aggression, and on. So there is, the jury is still out, but that's the kind of a radical approach or radical re-examination. It is, of course, informed by the atrocities that are being visited on Ukrainians by Russians, and the atrocities, let's not forget, that are enthusiastically supported by some 80% of common Russians. It's not the problem. The Putin is not a problem. The Putin is simply manifestation of the problem. Ukrainians cannot now, including Russian-speaking Ukrainians, Russian-cultured Ukrainians, Ukrainians who think of themselves as being deeply steeped in Russian culture, they cannot wrap their heads around what is going on now, what is being done in Ukraine, including to the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, like Kharkiv, like Mariupol, like Sumy, like Berdyansk, like Kherson, by Russians, where they are inclined to think that Russian culture is complicit in these brutalities across the board. And how it is complicit is now strategically important to try and understand. And talks of the so-called good Russian culture and good Russians within that vision are viewed simply as a distraction, as a kind of a red herring that takes us away, diverts the attention from this incredibly important task of trying to understand why, how this is all possible, how the two things can coexist within one nation, within one history, within one historical logic, which is Russian imperial culture. And I always, when I speak of Russian culture, I like to say imperial, but with the kind of proviso that there is a Russian culture that is not imperial. But I know very little about that Russian culture that is not imperial, because the thing is all too often is that the moment you scratch the good Russian culture, you start hearing the same old imperial narratives, attitudes, prejudices, and racism, and the kind of contemptuous attitude towards the so-called inarodцы, non-Russians.
Well, thank you, Professor. We're coming on the end of our lecture today. I don't know how you managed to squeeze much information in so little time. We cannot be any more grateful to you. You've been gracious with your time and generous with your knowledge. And hopefully there will be in the future more opportunities for us to benefit from your from your knowledge. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your invitation, and I hope yours and your students' interest in Ukraine grows rapidly in the future. All the best to you.
You can bet on that. Thank you. All the best to you.